welcome to a new style of video that we're going to be doing here at Naam. This is going to be a podcast style interview, and I know I've had a lot of interest from you guys about doing podcasts. So hopefully over the next few months we're going to be doing a lot more interviews and getting to know people who've got a lot of experience and knowledge in different parts of meditation and Sikhi in general. So today's interview and today's podcast is going to be trying to answer one of the most commonly asked questions that we get here at Naam, which is how to meditate, how to do Naam Simran. So you know that if you've been watching a lot of the Naam videos, we talk a lot about the concepts and things like that within Sikhi, about oneness and things like that. But a question that I keep getting asked again and again is, well, how do we actually do the meditation? What should I be expecting with my Naam Simran? So in today's podcast style video, I want to be looking at how do we meditate, how to apply meditation in your daily life, and then look at specific techniques of meditation and Naam Simran. But first, let me introduce my guests. So some of you will be familiar with a video that a friend of mine, Jasvinder Singh, and I did at the Akal channel at the One Show with Dr. Gurnaam Singh. We did a show going back a few months ago about the nature of suffering and what is suffering. And that video was really successful online. And I had quite a few people send me messages about Jasvinder Singh and saying, well, who is he? And does he have any more videos? So Jasvinder Singh, you're getting quite popular online.
You hadn't told me that before, but okay.
So we're getting a lot of people asking about Jasvinder Singh. And so let me give you an introduction as to how I met Jazz. We actually met through Naam, and a lot of people contact me on a daily basis. But Jazz contacted me about specifically these these poems that you were writing so beautifully. And as soon as I read some of those poems, I got to kind of understand what kind of level of thinking and what kind of level of spirituality you'd kind of gone through in your own personal experience. So I asked Jazz to come on the show. We've had a lot of conversations offline about very, very deep kind of spiritual conversations about lots of different subjects. And I've said to Jazz, look, I really want you to come on one of my videos and let's do an interview and let's talk about Naam Simran. So today, I know Jazz got a lot of experience with meditation in general, but today specifically I want to talk about Naam Simran and using mantra as a technique. So welcome to our very first podcast.
Thank you very much for the very kind introduction there. You've built me up to such an extent that I can only fall very, very far now.
I'm sure
so thank you for that.
I'm sure you won't disappoint anyone. So why don't we start by just you giving us a brief introduction to your experience of meditation, the types of meditations that you've done, and what have you got out of it?
Okay, so I got into meditation many years ago now, so probably in my late teens, which is a far distant memory now. It was primarily driven by a personal interest in kind of psychology and the mind, and actually my interest in meditation didn't actually start from Sikhism, although I was what I regard as an active Sikh and sort of believe in a lot of the philosophies and the ideas. It didn't seem that the meditation part didn't seem to resonate with me, and I actually got interested in meditation through other avenues. But as I got more into meditation and more into Sikhi in quite disparate ways, I slowly started to see the very close connection. And although it will probably sound obvious in this day and age in terms of Sikhi being about meditation and Naam, Japna and Simran, it wasn't obvious to me at the time. But once I made that connection, it really kind of motivated me on both paths and sort of got deeper and deeper into it from there.
So what kind of meditations had you tried? Like you said that you didn't necessarily make the association between Sikhi and meditation and Naam Simran. So what was your first sort of introduction to meditations?
So initially it was a kind of a combination of Vipassana, which I'm sure many people have heard of, and Vipassana is now kind of been rebranded almost as mindfulness meditation.
I mean, for those people who haven't experienced Vipassana or aren't familiar with that term, please explain it a little bit more.
Sure. So the Vipassana is basically a awareness type of approach to meditation. It's trying to bring present moment awareness to an object of meditation, and the objects of meditation actually vary as you go through the practice. So anyone who goes on a initial Vipassana course or maybe a mindfulness course, the initial object will be breath meditation. So I'm sure people have already seen videos about how you concentrate on your breath. That's basically a starting point for Vipassana. But other types of meditation that I initially sort of delved into were Zen types of meditation, and some of the Buddhist and Eastern style types.
Is that very much to do with silence?
So Zen is a very peculiar and particular type of meditation of learning to just be with yourself, and there's very limited instructions, which is why a lot of people who are getting into Zen find it quite difficult, because they don't actually tell you what to do beyond the postures.
Right.
It is a case of actually pointing you in the right direction, so pointing you in an introspective manner, and then letting your experience dictate.
So it's very much sort of exploring it rather than guided.
Yeah, very much exploring, and that really resonated with me, because the whole reason I got into meditation was just a curiosity. So even just having a practice which bona fide the approach of just looking inwards as being a useful technique, I found quite useful.
How did you then come across doing mantra? Because Zen and mantra, I would imagine, are almost two polar opposites in terms of technique, not necessarily in terms of what the achievement, what the goal is for, but certainly in terms of the technique. I
think to answer that question, it's really a case of the way I got into meditation, and the way most people actually get into meditation, is a bit back to front. It's almost as if you get into meditation because you've heard about a particular technique of meditation, and you dive into that. And then sometimes that will lead you to open your mind to other techniques and explore the whole sphere of meditation. But if I can parallel it, I often use the analogy of exercise. It's almost like getting into exercise by only doing a particular type of exercise, and then a year or two later realizing that exercise is this amazing thing for your entire health, and you can actually do loads of different types of exercises. A lot of exercises are related, you can do them in combination. So I went through a similar path in terms of I sort of delved into one or two particular types of meditation, and then that opened me up to realizing meditation was this entire sphere of kind of personal introspection, and then looked at Sikhi, my own background and my own upbringing, sort of coming into play, and realizing that there was this really powerful tool buried in my own backyard, as it were, and that I needed to explore that. So
see that I suppose we somewhat have sort of similar backgrounds in how we got into it. For me, I think growing up in I would say quite a normal Sikh household, and kind of the Sunday Sikhs going to the Gurdwara, just normal, just kind of going to the Gurdwara on a Sunday. I thought that for me, Sikhi was a lot to do with our history, and Kirtan was a big element of it, but really Simran was certainly not practiced in my family, and certainly wasn't something that was being pushed in the weekly Gurdwara sessions that I was going to. It wasn't something that people were talking about at all. It's only until I really got exposed to the mindfulness side of Sikhi, and the deeply spiritual message of Sikhi, non-duality and all those sorts of things, did it then start making sense for me to start learning, well, how do you achieve this? And again, I started getting introduced to meditation first, a bit like you, which was sort of breath meditation, becoming aware of my thoughts. I mean, initially it was a lot of sort of visualization and those sorts of things as well, and really just exploring, just sitting with myself and just spending time with myself, which I didn't almost make that connection that was anything to do with Sikhi. And I think very similar to you, it was only later that I kind of started looking at, well, what is the Sikh technique, and what is this thing about using a mantra or using a particular jap and repetition again and again. So again, that's sort of been my introduction to it. I mean, a lot of people get confused with this idea of meditation. I don't think, like you said, they don't necessarily marry this idea between doing Simran or mantra jap or Naam jap with meditation, and I think people see those two things as very different. And so in light of that, I think people are just confused when they hear the word meditation, and they just think that it's something new, like we're introducing something new into Sikhi. So, like, what would you say is the reason for someone to even try meditation, whether it's sort of more generally tried and tested meditation techniques, or whether it's specifically Naam Simran? Like, what are you trying to achieve? Why can't you just go and read Gurbani and just kind of learn the meanings of what it's saying and just understand this concept that there is a oneness and we're all connected? What do you reckon the need is for actually trying meditation? I
mean, so for me personally, my perspective on why anyone would want to entertain or should entertain meditation as part of their sort of daily life is effectively, if you want to understand your mind, and you want to understand yourself, you need to observe. your mind, and you need to observe yourself.
That's a really interesting way of putting it.
And so for me, meditation is a, very broadly speaking, again, this umbrella term of meditation that we're currently using, it is an approach of introspection and observing your mind, and therefore hoping to learn more about yourself. Now, why should that mean anything to anyone? Why would anyone want to learn about their mind? Well, effectively, once you start to look at your mind, you start to see the triggers of what are healthy behaviors and perhaps unhealthy behaviors, and what triggers and emotions and thought patterns lead to your suffering, or just not feeling great. We don't have to use big lofty words like suffering, but just not feeling great on a particular day, or just feeling a little bit better. So to start with, putting all the very esoteric spirituality stuff aside, it is just a process of, like exercises, you would advocate exercise to your parents and people who have never come across exercise as being this approach of, well, if you apply some physical exertion, it will be better for your health in the long run. Well, likewise, introspection is a process of, it can be quite difficult to start with, but it is good for your mental well-being in the long run. So that's a very effective starting point for me, which doesn't have to do with anything mystical or spiritual. It's a very practical daily practice to just be slightly healthier and happier. But to sort of again extend the metaphor of exercises, with exercise you can do a light jog in the morning and be slightly healthier and happier. Or you can become an Olympic athlete and be really sort of, on your game with this particular form. And meditation is likewise. It depends how far you want your interest in the mind and your place in the world to take you. And what we've seen from Sikhi and other sages and other traditions as well, that it can actually have some quite remarkable and transformative effects if you delve deeper and deeper and deeper. But I think it has practical, useful, and almost immediate benefits from anyone that actually wants to try it.
I really like that analogy of looking at meditation as exercise, and some of the questions just almost become irrelevant, because if somebody was to ask, well, what's the purpose of exercise?
Absolutely.
It's almost such an obvious answer that you wouldn't even ask that question. It's just so obvious. Well, why? Of course you want to do exercise, because it's just good for you. It's good for your health. It's good for your heart and your muscles, and it's good for burning fat and all those sorts of things. And I think in the same way, we almost need to start talking about meditation in that same way.
Absolutely.
Which is such an obvious benefit that it's good to do with sort of stress relief, knowing your own mind, understanding your reactions, as kind of you said, understanding why your emotions are kind of reacting in a particular way, and almost just knowing who you are a little bit better. It's kind of just going into and searching who you are. And I think that's a misconception that a lot of people make, is that they already know who they are, because they know their name, they know their likes, their dislikes, they know their job, they know all the thoughts that are inside their head, but they don't necessarily understand why they react in a particular way, and what they can do when they're in those situations. But going a little bit more into the spiritual side of it, because I can imagine a lot of people saying, yeah, that sounds great, that's a good reason in terms of like mental health and mental stability, emotional stability, but how do you connect that with religion? And for me, the clincher of understanding why you should do any sort of meditation is when you understand that the whole God thing that everyone talks about is actually inside you. And so if the whole God thing is inside you, then forget every other thing that you're doing in your religious practice. You have to go and look within yourself, because if you're not looking within yourself, then you've just kind of lost the whole point of it. The whole point of this any spiritual tradition, as far as I've understood them, is that you've got to go within yourself. And there's enough Gurbani that actually talks about that. It's sitting within you, it's inside you, it's at the core of who you are, it's the root of what you are. And when you start understanding that connection, which is that whatever you're doing in your religion is actually trying to find something inside you, then at some point you've got to actually take that dive and go within you.
Absolutely. And it's almost ironic in Sikhi especially, because the idea that God is within us and inside us is actually really prevalent, in mainstream Sikhi and people who have a real philosophical understanding or otherwise of Sikhi. And yet it almost gets said and then quite quickly dismissed. You're right. So it's,
yes, God's inside us, but
fantastic. Let's move on.
We all know that God's inside us.
Yeah, let's go get some langar.
Yeah, but now go doing your Amrit and your Naam Simran and do those things because you're going to please God.
Absolutely.
So straight away we push God back out there again.
Absolutely. So the fundamental question arises: well, if God is inside you, surely you need to spend some time finding where you are, because that's a good starting point. If God is inside you, and then also trying to work out effective means of getting into yourself and exploring yourself. And again, that just ties nicely back to what we're saying about meditation. That's exactly
so
what meditation
we've
is
talked
for.
a lot about the different techniques of meditation, and I mean, I want to keep a little bit of focus around Naam Simran and Mantar Jap specifically. Now, I know you and I both sort of have this view that Naam is not necessarily restricted to a word, and certainly I've covered videos on this subject, which is that Naam is basically this oneness energy, almost the experience of that oneness around the universe. But kind of sort of keeping that definition aside of this kind of wider concept of what Naam is. What do you think about Naam Simran as a meditation technique itself? And I don't necessarily mean to compare it with other meditations, but in terms of, is it effective? What are we doing with Naam specifically that it allows us to go on this inner journey?
Okay, so part of it, and again, this is obviously personal opinions, but part of it, I think, is this whole idea of giving yourself some mechanism to look in the right direction. So our normal daily conventional life is basically just a one series or another of events where we are looking outward at objects in the world, and we've talked about the importance of looking inwards. So what Naam Simran does is it gives us a very effective means of turning our attention inwards to look in the right direction. That's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is it's actually just an incredibly powerful way of building your powers of attention and powers of focus. So again, I'd always draw the analogy to exercise because I think it's just such a powerful one. People often have the complaint that, well, I've tried Naam Simran and I can't concentrate on reciting the word for more than a minute. I can't do it. It doesn't work for me. But that's almost like saying, well, I've tried running a marathon, took a jog for 10 minutes and I got tired, so I can't run a marathon.
So I can't run a marathon.
Exactly.
Yes.
The entire point of Naam Simran is to build your powers of perception, awareness, and focus. And the fact that you're failing at it is actually a sign that you're doing it right, not a sign that you're doing it wrong. Just as when you go to the gym, if you could lift every weight that was on the barbell, you're probably not working out the right muscle, you're probably not doing it in the right way. The fact that you fail is the sign that there is progress, because hopefully the next time you try it, you will fail a little bit later and a little bit later. And what you find is if you persist with it, you will basically build up these powers of perception that you can then use to bleed into your everyday life and introspect at much deeper and deeper levels.
I think that's brilliant. That's really an interesting way to look at it, that the more that you are trying it, you will slowly start to see an improvement. And again, it just falls right back into this kind of exercise and workout analogy.
Yeah.
The fact that you can't do Naam Simran for an hour doesn't mean that Naam Simran is ineffective, in the same way that you just can't go to the gym and pick up the heaviest weight. It's just a brilliant analogy.
Absolutely.
So let's kind of let's look at, how do you actually define Naam Simran? Like, what do you mean by that term Naam Simran? Because I'm sure a lot of people will probably have a lot of different understandings.
Sure.
I mean, for me, the common understanding is very much just the recitation of a mantar, usually Waheguru mantar.
Yeah.
What do you see as
so for me, I mean, I have personally distinguish the word Simran and Japa or Japna intentionally, because I think they have slightly two different flavors and slightly two different meanings. And the Gurbani will talk about Japping Naam and it will talk about Simrana.
Yeah.
Now Simrana, again, this is an area of massive philosophical debate and Korj and inquiry that scholars have done. But Simrana seems to be implying a kind of a remembrance, a kind of inhabiting an experience.
And that's what it means, isn't it? Simran,
exactly. Yeah,
Simran means to remember.
Absolutely.
Yeah. As opposed to, like, what you're saying is Jap, which is the actual practice of reciting.
Yes, and Japa being a very distinct, incremental recitation of a practice. Now, for me, I think Simrana almost is the kind of larger term, and Japa is a type of Simrana. It's a particular type of remembrance. But Naam Simrana is basically almost the kind of wider umbrella meditative term of just constant remembrance of something and just
Could we call it awareness?
I think so. I mean, I think you and I, we've had these conversations offline and possibly in videos as well before that. We talk about Naam in very different terms, perhaps to the sort of basic definitions that people are talking about. But Naam Simran fits very well if your idea of Naam is this all-encompassing oneness, non-dual experience, and you are constantly trying to keep that in mind, and you're constantly trying to find that in every interaction you're having. That's when it becomes this breath by breath, moment by moment, Simran on.
So it's from you're right. And we have this a shared vision here, a shared definition, which is that Naam Simran means to constantly be aware of the oneness.
Yeah.
And how you do that is to do Naam Japna.
Absolutely.
You do mantra jap to actually get into the habit of almost training your brain. And I do the same thing with my children when they've got a spelling test. Is that how do you learn to spell a particular word? Is they literally have to say it out loud until they've and I tell them that they're training their brain. They're actually making their brain remember the spelling, because you just repeat something again and again.
Yeah,
so that's a good way to kind of almost distinguish Jap from Simrana and Simran in general.
Absolutely. I think the other thing to mention with Naam Japna is just the fact that, just expounding upon the point about it pointing you in the right direction. There are various experiences that start to come to light, and these are not mystical or magical experiences. They are just conventional experiences that you have in your everyday life that remain normally unscrutinized. But with Naam Japna, with this practice of actually reciting either mentally or verbally, because you're doing this repetitive task time and time again, and possibly spending half an hour a day, every single day doing this, you can start to see how this thought, this mental word, audible sound, or this actual audible sound is coming out, is generated from your body. So you can start to see the mechanisms at play, and also the interruptions in those mechanisms. So you're trying to jap this naam, and then suddenly a thought will come in, and you can see how you interact with that thought and how it then goes away, and the point at which you remember again that you're supposed to be doing this meditation. These are all, unfortunately, the signs of most people's frustrations when they first start. But again, I would tie it back into that's actually the thing working.
So
that's showing you.
Well, let's talk about that. How do you get somebody to start? What is the starting point, and what are the almost the immediate obstacles that we know that they're going to face? What would you say is like the most basic starting point?
I mean, if you've never done meditation before, just sitting down, being quiet without any external inputs, at very least, will normally people find that quite a difficult experience.
I think people would just stop at that point, because if you just sit, for the first time you're having to face your mind,
Absolutely.
And you just can't deal with the fact that your mind is just constantly talking. And I think, like you, that's not a bad thing. That's literally just being aware that this is what your mind's doing all the time.
Absolutely.
You're not necessarily, your mind doesn't go into hyperdrive all of a sudden. It doesn't become faster just because you're sitting down. It's literally just showing you what your mind is doing all the time. Except now you've got nowhere to vent that attention, you're forced to look at it for the first time.
Absolutely. And it can be a very uncomfortable experience for people.
Yeah.
It can, the types of thoughts people have are not always going to be positive ones. They're being fired at you constantly by your mind. Your mind is in this habit of a lifetime to just constantly talk at you. And now you've decided to sit in a room or a dark space quietly and listen to it for the first time. And that can be quite a difficult experience. But again, this is where we get to the basic techniques of you give yourself an object like a mantra. It's positive if that mantra has some emotional meaning or connection, which is why certain words might be advocated and certain words might resonate more with you than others, which is absolutely fine.
So you think that's important, to actually have that emotional connection?
I think it can help.
So because you've invested some sort of reverence into that word, you feel like actually that's I'm calling something that's like they call it. I think in some of the Eastern tradition they call it an Ishtadev. Something, some being that you've kind of created some affiliation or love towards.
Absolutely, and almost actually there's countless stories which I'm sure you're aware in the Zen traditions and various Buddhist traditions and even in the Hindu traditions and old sages, they would make their students go through extreme trials before they received this mantra. And the idea behind that was, there's nothing magic about a word. In all honesty, words are just sounds, but they then attached this very powerful meaning that they had received something of such great value, and it had taken them such tribulation to actually get that value.
So they value it more, they're going to use
absolutely.
that mantra is going to have a different psychological effect on
if I walked up to you asked me how to meditate, and I told you to say the word cupboard to yourself,
yes.
For an hour a day, you probably wouldn't do it.
Yes.
But actually, in terms of the mechanisms that are going on inside you, it probably would actually achieve most of them. It just doesn't have that emotional connection to keep you interested, to keep you looking. So it can actually help. It can help having a word or a sound that actually means something to you, that has some sort of connection, because that helps you to keep the interest there.
But one of the things I've always been an advocate for is that if a particular word from a tradition that's not your native language, if that word just doesn't resonate with you initially, I've always been an advocate for people to actually just pick another word. Yeah, and even if that word is in English, and I mean, I've been trialing and quite successfully, and I talk quite openly about using the fact that I use "this is you" as a very profoundly impactful mantra for me. But in the same way, you could possibly use just grace or peace. It depends on what you're trying to go for and what you're trying to do. But even Jo Tera Hukum, that can be or this is your grace, or this is your gift.
Absolutely.
So I mean, so basically, what we're saying is, I think we need to allow people time to figure out what their mantra is going to be first. And either you just take the standard mantra, whether it's Waheguru or Satnam or whatever the word is, but pick one and then actually start doing something with it. So let's say they've picked a mantra. What do they do next with it? And they've learned that they need to sit down with it.
Sure. Okay, so a good way to start is, because our minds are so busy, our lives are so busy, is just give yourself some time. Give yourself a time in the day, part of your routine. Carve out that time, maybe in the morning or in the evening, whenever it's comfortable for you.
So allocate some specific time.
Allocate some specific time when you're not going to be bothered, the kids are not going to be running around, you're not likely to get a call. These practical things sound obvious, but they're so actually important, because it will allow your mind not to be distracted, or
I think that makes Amrit Vela just sound so completely practical as well.
Absolutely.
Of course, it makes sense while everybody else is asleep and there's no distractions. No one's going to be calling you. You don't necessarily need to be checking your emails at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning.
Absolutely.
So that just makes perfect sense.
It does, and it's often with these things in Sikhi and our traditions that what has now taken on a mystical and magical kind of notion, like Amrit Vela, there must be something magical going on at that time, was actually just born out of just real sensible, rational, practical ways of doing things. And I think that is one of them. It is a quiet time that you can dedicate to yourself and just be concentrating on this particular task and be less chance of being distracted. But very simply, you find a comfortable position. Now, I can't actually overemphasize how important it is to find a comfortable position. A lot of people and a lot of meditative traditions will prescribe certain positions.
Poses and
a lot of people will spend 6 months to 8 months just struggling with these poses and never really even get started on the work that they need to do in their mind, because they're so concerned about their back and their knees and things like that.
And in fact, that kind of fires off more thoughts about
your inadequacy at being able to do this.
So I can completely second that. For me, just getting into a comfortable position, so the point at which, for me, it's that if you're sitting down and you're meditating, you don't want to be thinking about your body, you don't want to be thinking about if you need to prop yourself up with a pillow,
absolutely.
If you need to lean against a wall, it absolutely doesn't make a difference. In fact, I encourage it, go and be as comfortable as possible. So find a quiet time, find a comfortable space that that you can just sit there for a reasonable length of time.
So once you've got that, and even finding a comfortable position actually takes a bit of practice. So you shouldn't beat yourself up as if you're sitting in a nice comfortable position and within a couple of minutes you get a scratch and an itch. These are all common symptoms of starting to meditate.
And don't beat yourself up about it. Like, it's natural for you to have an itch or a scratch. And for me, it's certainly, after a while in a particular position, I have no qualms about changing position, as long as I change the position, but it doesn't change my focus. Like, in fact, changing the position to just make my body a little bit more comfortable in one direction or other is fine, because I can just carry on with my meditation. Had I forced myself to sit in that position, then at some point I'll just start getting my focus on the position itself. So actually, absolutely. I do change it every now and then if I need to.
And as you well know, because we've discussed this, meditation is, the ultimate desire of meditation is to come off the meditation cushion. It's to take it out into the world. So, movements and, bodily sensations and things like that shouldn't detract from it, but it actually should be used as part of the meditative process. But when you start out, it's useful just to try to push away as many distractions as you can, and those kind of experiences and those kind of meditative practices can come later on. But effectively, what you're trying to do is give yourself some degree of sensory deprivation. It sounds like quite a lofty term, but really what we're saying is just quiet, dark, room with a reasonable amount of comfort, so you're not basically, distracted by various bodily sensations at the outset. And I'm aware that there's actually a big debate in Sikhi about whether what's prescribed in the Guru Granth Sahib Maharaj is a audible, loud Japna or a silent, quiet one. And that can be quite a heated debate. For me, my personal answer is I think you should just try both and actually just see what works for you. And surely that's the most sensible thing to do, as opposed to vehemently try to dogmatically stick to a process that isn't working for you. And for me personally, I think the internal quiet Japana is very powerful, because again, it feels like I'm getting closer to the source of what I'm trying to tackle. This is an internal investigation, and internal Japana is just feels like a closer signpost to that. So I would personally sort of advocate that approach.
So are you literally just, once you found a comfortable position, you just start? There's no sort of build up to anything. You just literally sit down, find a comfortable position, and you just start using that, repeating that mantra. Is that how you would do it?
That's what I would say is a good starting approach. But some people do find it a little bit easier to maybe just relax for a couple of a minute or so, maybe concentrate on the breath, just to sort of calm themselves down.
Yeah, that's certainly what I do. For me, as soon as I sit down, the mind is already floating in 10 different directions. So I use breath meditation, and I've got a lot of videos on our Facebook page where at least 10-15 minutes you kind of go through this process, maybe a bit of a body scan or something like that. And what I'm trying to do there is I'm just trying to get my awareness so separated from my thoughts that the thoughts don't necessarily aren't at the very front, the focus of what I'm doing. And I find at that point Naam Simran is just, you're just a lot more receptive to it, because I've found that if you sit down with Naam Simran and you just start, then it's almost as if you're kind of battling a noisy mind with just another sound, and you're somehow trying to just battle between the two.
Absolutely.
And sometimes your awareness will be on the sound of the mantra, and sometimes it'll just go on the thoughts itself. So just to distance yourself between the thoughts, and then to do Naam Simran, I find personally anyway, you're just able to get into it. And I think this is the point that we're making, is to be flexible with whatever approach you use, so that you don't think, well, I'm not doing it right. Actually, if it's working for you, you're doing it right.
Exactly.
And if it's not working for you, you're doing it wrong.
And the problem is with this approach, this discipline in life, is unlike again, using exercise as an example, unlike sort of physical training in the gym, you can get a personal trainer to watch the way you're doing it and basically correct you and almost give you real-time feedback as to how you're doing it. With here, you have to be your own coach. The awareness that you're applying to yourself and seeing how you're reacting to things. Do I need to sit and concentrate on my breath before I can do some Naam Simran? Is actually just starting out with Naam Simran a good way for me to calm down in the first place? You're trying to cultivate this curiosity in yourself. That's actually that's the main thing you're trying to do here. So as opposed to trying to rigorously perform a prescribed meditation, what's actually needed is a curiosity and a real desire for you to understand yourself. And if you're going to do that, you become your own laboratory and you become your own kind of self-correction mechanism. Well, that didn't work for me yesterday. Let me try something slightly different. You're still doing Naam Japana, but you can do Naam Japana, mantra Naam Japana, in hundreds of different ways. And now that might sound daunting, but actually what that really means is a lot of those will work for you. And even if some of them don't, just tweak it slightly, tweak your approach to it slightly, and you might have more success. So,
what do you think some of the barriers are going to be for someone who's begun to start actually meditating? They've found a bit of time, they've found a mantra, they're doing it on a regular basis. What's going to be the initial hurdles, or what can they expect to be some of the benefits of actually doing that? Like, what are they trying to get out of it? Because you mentioned a lot about pointing you in the right direction. Well, at this point, all we're doing is we're just focusing our awareness on the sound of a mantra, whether you choose to do it out loud or whether it's just the idea of that mantra. And what do you think some of the initial, or certainly from your experience, the initial barriers are going to be?
So the initial barriers, I think, as we've already touched upon, one of the most obvious one is just the internal monologue just intruding constantly.
So your inner voice.
Your inner voice, that thing which you talk to yourself with and talks all the time will just carry on intruding. And then there will also be the loss of focus which comes with that. So you will be reciting a mantra and then you will just forget. So this constant repetitive forgetfulness of the task that you're trying to do. And now initially that can be, again, it can be quite disheartening that you've given yourself such a simple task Just recite the word for 5 minutes, for 10 minutes. That's all I need to do. Nothing complicated. And actually, I can't even do that.
Right.
And that's quite a revelation for people. But again, I would encourage that that's a good thing, because you're at day one on the gym and you've just realised that actually when you lift a weight, it hurts.
So is that what they're trying to do? They're trying to do a month there for a significant period of time where there isn't an inner monologue, there isn't a voice going on in the head?
Not necessarily. I think a better way of describing it or characterising it would just be where the internal monologue doesn't necessarily have the power to pull your attention.
To distract you.
Yeah, it doesn't have the power to drag you around.
Yeah.
If you look at your experience in any given day and just sort of try to watch your mind, you will realise how much power the mind has just to drag you from one thought to the next experience. Whereas this type of mantra meditation, A, it highlights that very early on, that's going on, but B, it gives you, just by trying to get back to the mantra that you're trying to recite and continually recite that and then lose focus and then come back to it again, it builds that muscle. It builds that muscle of pulling your focus back. So slowly and slowly, although the thoughts will still intrude, that's kind of what the mind does, it's kind of what the ego does, it talks to you all day long. You will lose interest in them, or that's what I found in particular. You'll see the patterns that arise. So 5 minutes into your meditation, your mind will tell you, I really must send that email, I really must think about the meeting. The 5th day after you do that, you're going to be kind of like, I've seen this pattern before. I've seen the fact that my mind just wants to distract me with the first thing I need to do at work. And really, I know that if I don't think about this now, it's not going to have an impact on my day. I can think about it as soon as I finish my meditation. Now, you don't have to say all this to yourself, but that almost becomes intuitive.
Yeah.
It becomes intuitive, and you start becoming a lot more effective at just batting these thoughts away, or just letting them flitter away and sort of die out.
So one of the analogies that's really worked for me to try and understand what you're trying to do with your mind during meditation is to think of the analogy of standing on a platform at a train station. So for me, meditation is remaining on the platform. Now, if you're at a train station, you've only got one train that you have to catch. You don't catch every single train that comes along, but there's hundreds of trains. And in the same way, your mind is just going to produce hundreds and hundreds of different thoughts. But if you can allow yourself to just observe, acknowledge the fact that there's a thought coming, but you don't jump on that thought, because you know that as soon as you jump on the thought, and you almost don't notice that you've done it. It's just like almost like all of a sudden, how did I get on this train? It's the same way. You kind of get on this thought, and only maybe a minute or two down the line, or maybe 5 minutes down the line, you realise, I'm supposed to be doing Naam Simran, or maybe your voice is doing Naam Simran, but your mind has just gone on because you've allowed yourself to jump on that thought. Absolutely. So I describe it as practicing not jumping on the train. That you're practicing not jumping on that thought. You're just sitting there, and the mantra is the thing that allows you to stay grounded onto the platform itself.
Absolutely.
It's the thing that's always reminding you, come back to the platform, come back here, so stay in this place.
And that's I think you've touched upon a quite a crucial another difficulty that people find, and actually I found as well, that even though I built up a kind of a mental focus, enough mental focus to recite Naam, my mind still seemed to have enough energy to carry on doing other thoughts. So you're now running in parallel. You're kind of trying to talk to yourself and fight the volume of the thoughts going on. And again, I think this is actually where either having a word which has some sort of meaning for you, some sort of emotional connection, or some sort of idea that you can help concentrate on. So it's not just a sound, but you are almost reciting a emotion, or you're reciting a feeling or an idea that can have a lot more hold than just a word. Like, again, I mean, if I go back to, if I asked you to recite cupboard in your head, quietly, your mental monologue would go crazy, and you'd probably still more or less be able to recite the word cupboard without having any effect on your state of mind. Whereas something which kind of grabs your attention is quite useful.
So we're almost, and you're kind of moving into this idea, because first we started talking about Naam as just being a word. So there are thoughts, so there's active thinking going on, and then there is this word that's somehow kind of allowing you to move away from those thoughts. But now we're almost introducing the idea that the word has to have some sort of meaning associated with it, because surely at some point, even if you get very good at just reciting this word again and again and again, and you're not being distracted by your thoughts, surely that's not the end goal.
Absolutely.
What's the next step then? What are you trying to do with that word? Let's say you've kind of become quite efficient at not being distracted by your mind. What is that word trying to do? What are we trying to do with it?
That's a massive question with loads of different answers, actually. I mean, one of the things is once you've built up some mental focus, you can go in a number of different ways. You can either use that mental focus to start exploring yourself. So where is this word coming from? What does it actually sound like to hear a word that's not actually audible and outside? What's the difference between my external experience and my internal experience? You can concentrate on, can I find the location of that word?
What do you mean by that?
So, where were your thoughts? That's a key kind of spiritual question. And effectively, once you've got good enough at looking at your thoughts, or just having your thoughts be concise enough that you can actually focus on them, you can start to explore about what these thoughts are. And effectively, your mental mantra is a thought. It's a thought of a very concise and particular point. So you can start to add in this curiosity with it. Now, this is why I say that there are hundreds of ways you could use to explore it, and the different questions might take hold of you, and then actually it has a kind of snowball effect, because your mental focus is now built up to an extent that you can now ask these questions of it. Where is this thought coming from? Who's saying it? What's the voice like? What's the sound like? And then actually, when you start to build up that interest, it actually perpetuates your mental focus, because now you're more interested in doing this.
So you're not just trying to ignore the thoughts, the inner voice that you've constantly had, but now you're actually really exploring it. So I could almost give the analogy that if Naam Simran has been used in Gurbani to describe a boat, that's somehow carrying you across. So if you're now no longer interested in the ocean, which is this kind of this field of thoughts within the mind, and you're actually exploring the boat, and you're saying, well, where is this boat? What am I doing here? And who is on this boat? So it's almost looking at the Naam in more focus, and actually where is the sound coming from within you?
Absolutely. The other one that I think people will surprisingly, this is something that people do start to experience if you maintain this practice for any reasonable length of time, is you start to notice the kind of automaticity of the Naam Simran. So it's a bit strange, because in Sikhi actually it's kind of put up on this pedestal, at least in sort of mainstream Sikhi, about japa turning into ajapa, where basically the japa that you're actively doing suddenly starts doing itself. But actually what you find in practice, and what a lot of people find in practice, that's actually quite easy for the mind to just become automated.
Autopilot.
Absolutely. So once you've given it this task and you've done it enough times, if you give it any thought, it actually makes sense, for the mind is a very efficient thing. It says, okay, if that's what you're trying to do for half an hour in the morning, I'll just do it for you.
Well, you only have to have been exposed to an annoying song, and you realise that for the rest of the day, that annoying song is just in your mind for the whole day.
Absolutely.
So I suppose what you're trying to say, if correct me if I'm wrong, is that just because your mind starts repeating it automatically doesn't necessarily mean that you've progressed.
It doesn't mean that you've progressed, but it is a interesting milestone for you to start exploring in a different way. So, the point I'm trying to get at is, once you start seeing that the voice that you thought you had control of and were using to say a particular word is now doing it of its own accord, it brings up the question, well, where's that voice coming from, and who's really responsible?
Oh, that's really interesting. So initially you're thinking, I'm doing the Naam Simran.
Absolutely.
And when that starts becoming automated, well, it's like, well, what is this process now that's doing it? And then I suppose ultimately I always bring it back to things like the self-identity and the ego, which is, well, if I'm not doing that Naam Simran, then what am I?
Exactly. So it starts to give you these slight hints. And again, this comes back to the whole point of what we said of Naam Simran is about pointing you in the right direction. And then you can start asking the right questions. So this is one way in which it does it. Once Naam Simran starts to take hold and you start to become automated with it, you suddenly start to realise, well, if it's not me, what is it? And that's not to say that you'll suddenly have a mind-blowing ego loss experience at that point, but it starts to chip away at this idea that you're responsible for everything going on and you're actively doing this. Whereas actually what you see, there's a lot of automated responses. There are a lot of things which you don't feel responsible for, and it can start to chip away at your sense of free will. And then when you read the Guru Granth Sahib the next day and it talks about hukum and it talks about, you're not in control, suddenly that takes a hold of you. So this is where the snowball effect happens, because now you've read this line and you've had some subtle experience of it. So the next time you meditate, you're going to look for it even with a greater vigour. So this is why, the meditative path but still diving into Gurbani on a daily basis or on a regular basis can be so powerful, because it reinforces each other, this experience that you're having and this intellectual understanding of what you're having. And if you don't have the knowledge of Gurbani, then that's what Sangat is for.
I suppose that goes back to your analogy about when you're training and you have a personal trainer. Certainly in meditation, initially it's going to feel like you have no guidance, but actually if you do regularly go back to Gurbani, you can actually start seeing that the Gurbani is already talking about stages that you might be tasting or experiencing, and then seeing, right, okay, well, this is now showing me that I'm going in this direction. But every time for me is an opportunity to explore what the Guru is saying and saying, well, is that working for me? What does it mean for me? The Guru's talking about Naam Simran and ego and hukam all in the same sentence.
Absolutely.
Well,
Absolutely.
how do those concepts work with me? And so actually starting to use the wisdom and combine it with your practical experience.
Absolutely.
So Jazz, I want to move on to this idea of people's expectations within Naam Simran. Certainly one of the things that I found is that meditation with any expectation is like a guarantee to fail, because you're sitting there and it's like you've kind of decided that there's going to be some magic experience, and then all of a sudden you realize it's not like that because your mind is in the way and all those sort of things. How much of a barrier do you think expectation is?
It can be a massive barrier. Not only can it be a barrier, but it can actually, in my experience and the experience of people I've sort of worked with on sort of helping to learn how to meditate, it can be the thing that can actually take them backwards before they go forward.
Right.
Because you hear about the experiences of people, you hear about these kind of ideas behind what meditation can bring, and so they just build up this massive expectation of what you should be seeing in a week or a month or maybe even 2 or 3 months. And when you don't get that, as opposed to actually calming the voice in your head, it can actually inflame it, because now the voice is telling you it's not going to work for you. It works for everyone else, it's not going to work for you. You don't know how to do this. And that the thing I tell to people is the most common symptom of meditation is the one which is so widely known that everyone basically will pick themselves out as being different. It doesn't work for me. It works for everyone else. Naam Japna works for all these people, they're all talking about God and this and that, and all, but for me it doesn't work. I've tried it doesn't work. That's the thing that we all experience, and again, it's a symptom that we need to be aware of, because then we're better equipped to tackle it.
I was trying to bring it back to essentially what the most common understanding of Sikhi is, which is around the whole God thing, the whole idea that there is this oneness. For me, Naam Simran, if you ultimately understand non-duality, and this is where non-duality works really well, is that if you understand that the oneness that everyone keeps talking about in Gurbani is essentially a part of what you're made of, or you are part of it, or it's all intertwined, and essentially you are God and God is you. And we read Gurbani's lines such as Sab Gobind hai, Sab Gobind hai, Gobind bin nahi koi. Essentially everything is God. If we understand that Naam Simran isn't me calling God and God being something far, that if you first have to almost accept the premise that this God thing, if that's the thing that you're looking for, or this oneness is you, and you're not just confined to your mind and your body, but you are actually part of this greater thing, that's when Naam Simran really starts taking you into a very, very almost deep spiritual experience, where it's now redefining your understanding of yourself. And for me, the clincher has always been when you lose expectation and you just allow yourself to get into the fact that this is God, or whatever the mantra is. Essentially, that's what you're saying with your mantra. You're not saying I'm calling God, but as essentially that this is oneness and I am that oneness. I am one. Then for me, what Naam Simran starts doing is that you start redefining or reprogramming your mind to no longer just identify with I am me, but you are basically, this oneness is what this is, what my body is, what my mind is this oneness, as opposed to Satpal or Jazz or this is just me as the individual. So I think there is this kind of, ultimately it can get you there, because I'm sure based on the conversation that we're having so far is people might be asking the question, well, that's all fine, but how does Naam Simran get you to merge with God? And I think absolutely. That's my experience of it, is that you start to redefine your understanding of yourself. You no longer define yourself as the ego-based individual. Absolutely.
I mean, just coming back to your point about expectations, because I think it is such a big barrier. I mean, one of the analogies that we can use about expectation and the impact it has is just when we try to fall asleep at night. You get in bed, and if you are thinking about the fact that what you're trying to do there is fall asleep, you can guarantee you will not
fall asleep.
Sleep is not something that you can do. It's something that kind of happens to you, and it happens to you when you're not trying to do it. If you get into bed as part of your routine, you lie down, you get into your position as part of your routine, all almost automated, maybe even you think certain thoughts as part of your routine, what you'll find is you will fall asleep because your body just knows. It knows what to do with that routine. If you sit there and you try to fall asleep,
or you're thinking, right, I'm looking,
absolutely.
Like I've sometimes tried to think about, let me see the point at which I fall asleep.
Exactly.
It just never happens.
Well, that's actually a good meditative exercise as well, actually. That's a kind of, I think you're letting on some of the curiosity that starts to take hold of you because you start analysing all your experience, especially the kind of non-conventional ones, and you start thinking, well, I'm conscious now and I'm unconscious. What's the difference between that? What's a barrier? What's a line at which that gets crossed? But that's probably not a good way.
You can't
that's
sleep.
That's not normally a good way to fall asleep.
Exactly.
That's a good meditative exercise. But meditation's similar in terms of if you go into it with the expectation of I need to meditate, or you keep checking on yourself, am I meditating yet? Am I meditating? You've got to think about, that's almost like you being in bed saying, am I asleep yet? Am I asleep yet? The right way to go to sleep is just stop asking yourself and just follow the routine. Follow the routine that you know is healthy for you to go to sleep. Likewise, meditation, build up a routine to the extent that it becomes natural, it becomes normal, it becomes something that's part of your life, it's something that you're going to do. And what you find is you much easier, not every day, you're going to have ups and downs, but it becomes more often than not, it's a lot easier to get into a relaxed space, a quiet space, where you can start exploring, or just, if you don't want to explore, just do the Naam Japna because it actually feels good. Align it with your breath, because that can feel quite nice and relaxing. So this becomes this moment in your day that you can carve out.
In the last couple of minutes, I just want to start exploring this idea around, can you do a mantra jap and Naam Simran or Naam Japna throughout the day, as opposed to just sitting down? Does it need to be sitting down? Because Gurbani does talk about like your mind can remember during all sorts of things that you're doing. What's been your experience of using a mantra specifically throughout the day?
So I think to accelerate your progress on Naam Japna, and especially initially to build up your focus, I think it can be quite interesting just to set yourself tasks in the day. So, personally, what I used to do when I first started out was actually decide that from the point I woke up in the morning to the point that I made my breakfast, I decided, mentally had the decision that I didn't need to think. Actually, there was no need for me to think. I didn't need to think about my meetings. I knew it was an unhealthy habit for me. So I'm just going to do Naam Japna for a short period. It doesn't have to be a long period. So while you're sort of going about your daily tasks, you just do that same sort of practice of Naam Japna and bringing your thoughts back and bringing your mind back to that object. You can even start off when you're brushing your teeth. For the point at time I enter the room and I'm brushing my teeth, let me just see if I can do Naam Japna. Now it will be a difficult thing because what you're turning this into, in this particular respect at very least, is this kind of mental exercise. And the fact that it's a mental exercise and not some spiritual awakening practice is okay. Part of this is about mentally exercising your brain so it is better, healthier, wiser, and then better equipped to have the kind of insights that might be required of spiritual awakening if that's what you're after. But that can become a very effective way, because if you can do it during activities and tasks, then you'll find when you do sit on your meditation cushion a week later, or or the next day, or whatever it is, the fact that you've now not distracted yourself with anything, you'll just find it a little bit easier to do. So
I find it's really effective if you know that you're going to sit down and do a meditation, or if you're going to do your Amrit Villa or whatever it is. I find it a really useful technique that the build up to that Amrit Villa for the first half an hour while you're brushing your teeth, as soon as you've got out of bed, whatever it is that you're doing, is that you start your meditation practice, your Naam Japna practice, and then it means that as soon as you've sat down to do your or even if you're sitting down to do part or whatever, you've already done that sort of fine tuning. And I call that period, like, you would never, if you're a professional musician, you would never sit down and just start playing you wouldn't just start performing. You'd got to tune your instrument, and I see that sort of the breathing or the mantra jap before you even do Barnia or before you even read any of your Nitnem, is that you actually do that. So if you're doing that before you sit down, it becomes very effective. And I think for me, the only other thing that I would add to that is that using this idea of this oneness, that there is oneness and everything is part of the oneness, that is so powerful throughout the day, because it makes such a difference with how you react to scenarios. I mean, just think about your everyday habits when you're driving. You know, what could you be thinking about? And we already know from scientific research that, you know, the loudness of music that you listen to and the tempo of the music that you're listening to affects the speed that you're driving, affects how you react, and road rage and things like that. But now, just the way that you're conducting your mind throughout simple exercises like that means that you're not necessarily going to have that initial instinctive reaction that you would always have if somebody cut up in front of you, or whatever your triggers are for, people that make you angry, people that annoy you, even people who you don't get on with at work or at school or at home or whatever it is that you have a practice that allows you to deal with that, because you're almost training your brains. Like if you said like sab gobind hai, you're now not only redefining who you are, but you're redefining all the scenarios around you. So I think it's so important to do it sitting down, but it's almost so much more effective when you're doing it on an everyday, day-to-day basis, because everything becomes part of your meditation.
Absolutely.
And I think this is how I almost make the distinction between meditation and mindfulness. Meditation is almost always restricted to a particular time and a very formal practice, and your mindfulness is just that informal practice of just doing it all the time. And I've almost coined this phrase of what Naam Simran is, which I call it mantra mindfulness, which is being mindful throughout the day, using a mantra to help you be mindful. And throughout the day, I just find it so effective to use a mantra to just help me constantly remember. And if the whole point of Naam Simran is to remember the oneness at all times, then surely you have to be doing that mantra Aat Peher. You've got to be doing it 24 hours a day.
Absolutely. But this is where the idea of the mantra almost becomes it's more than a word. We're starting to get into the realm of where it starts to evolve into an experience, into an emotion, into a feeling, basically. And then the idea is that you're not actually just reciting this word, but out in the world you're calling up this emotion, you're calling up this feeling, you're calling up this openness that you might have started to feel on the cushion. But again, we talked about this idea of meditation on a meditation cushion or on a chair should bleed into your life, and that's ultimately what we're looking for. We're looking for the control that we're cultivating of our mind in formal practice, as it were, to be something that we can access at any point in time in the day. And obviously we'll fail at it, and we all do, and that's part of the practice. But the key thing is that we'll get better at it because we're actually actively putting some effort into doing it.
Jazz, I know we could end up talking about this for a whole day. It's been amazing having you on the podcast today, and I'm really, really pleased that I've managed to get finally managed to get you to sit down with me and actually have this conversation. I really hope that we can do some more podcasts together. So thank you so much for turning up.
It's been a pleasure.
And thank you to everyone who's watched this podcast today. This is the first of hopefully many that we're going to be doing. I hope you enjoy it. Please do check out a lot of our other videos on Facebook and on Nanak Naam's YouTube channel, which is www.nanaknaam.org. You can find all the links there. And of course, like I always remind you guys, we are a charity. The reason we're doing all of this work is that we're trying to bring out some of that kind of hidden understanding of Sikhi and Gurbani and bring it into our day-to-day lives. So we do rely on your sponsorship. We do rely on your donations, and just keep supporting Nanak Naam, keep sharing our work, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.